Picture this. Right now, as you're watching this video, there are massive cities sprawling across every continent. New York, Tokyo, Dubai, Sao Paulo, skyscrapers reaching toward the clouds, highways connecting everything, the internet linking billions of minds together in an instant. We've got smartphones, satellites, self-driving cars. We put people on the moon more than 50 years ago. We've sent robots to Mars. We've decoded our own DNA. All of this, everything that defines modern civilization, happened in the last 10,000 years. That's it. Just 10,000 years from the first farming villages to landing on the moon. But here's the thing that should keep you up at night. Modern humans, people anatomically identical to you and me, have existed for at least 300,000 years. Think about that timeline for a second. 300,000 years of humans with the same brain capacity we have today. The same potential for innovation, creativity, problem solving. And for 290,000 of those years, we built basically nothing. No cities, no agriculture, no writing, no permanent structures, just small groups of people wandering from place to place, hunting animals, gathering plants, sleeping under the stars or in caves. For nearly 250,000 years, our ancestors lived this way. The same lifestyle, generation after generation after generation. What were they doing all that time? That's the mystery we're diving into tonight. And if you're using this video to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly what it's for. So maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely love checking those. It's wild seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching at the same time. Now, most history documentaries start with Mesopotamia, with Egypt, with the first civilizations. But that's like starting a movie in the final act. The real story, the long story, happened way before that. For 90,000 years after anatomically modern humans evolved, we did something. We survived. We adapted. We migrated across entire continents. We developed language, art, complex social bonds, sophisticated tools. We learned to thrive in environments from scorching deserts to frozen tundras. But we didn't build cities. We didn't plant crops. We didn't domesticate animals or create empires or write anything down. Why not? Were our ancestors just not smart enough? No. Archaeological evidence shows they had the same brain capacity we do. They could think abstractly, plan for the future, create complex tools. Some of the most ingenious survival strategies humans have ever devised came from this period. Were they too busy surviving? Maybe, but plenty of hunter-gatherer groups had significant leisure time. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers show they often work fewer hours per week than people in agricultural or industrial societies. Were they missing some crucial piece of knowledge? Perhaps. But what knowledge? What was the secret ingredient that finally triggered the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago? This is the 90,000-year mystery. The vast expanse of human history that gets skipped over in textbooks. The era when we were fully human but living lives almost unimaginable to us today. Tonight we're going on a journey through that hidden history. We'll start in Africa around 100,000 years ago, when a small population of modern humans began the journey that would eventually populate the entire planet. We'll experience what daily life was actually like for these ancient people. How they found food, raised children, dealt with danger, created meaning in their world. We'll follow the Great Migration as humans spread out of Africa, crossing into Asia, Europe, eventually reaching Australia and the Americas. We'll explore the birth of art, the first cave paintings and carved figurines that prove our ancestors weren't just surviving. They were thinking about beauty, meaning, the sacred. We'll look at their technology, the steady accumulation of knowledge passed down through generations. Fire, spears, clothing, shelter, boats, each innovation hard-won through trial and error. And we'll grapple with the fundamental question that drives this entire mystery. If humans were capable of building civilizations for 90,000 years, why did it take so long? What changed 10,000 years ago that finally pushed us over the edge from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers to city builders? The answer isn't simple. It involves climate change, lucky accidents, population pressure, and probably a few things we still don't fully understand. But one thing is certain. Those 90,000 years weren't wasted time. They weren't humanity just spinning its wheels, waiting for someone to invent farming. They were the foundation. Everything that came after, every civilization, every achievement, every part of human culture today, grew from seeds planted during those long millennia of wandering. Our ancestors weren't primitive. They were pioneers, and their story is ours. So let's go back, way back, to a time when the human population was small, the world was wild, and every day was an adventure in survival. It's 100,000 years ago, and you're about to discover what your ancestors really did for 90,000 years before building the first cities. Here's what most people don't understand about the emergence of modern humans. We didn't just suddenly appear 100,000 years ago, fully formed, ready to dominate the planet. The truth is far stranger and more complex than that. Your direct ancestors, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, have been walking around Africa for at least 200,000 years before 100,000 BCE. Maybe longer. Recent discoveries in Morocco push the date back to 300,000 years ago. These people looked like us. If you dressed them in modern clothes and put them on a subway, nobody would look twice. Same skull shape, same body proportions, same basic physical equipment, but they weren't us. Not yet. Because for at least 200,000 years, these anatomically modern humans were doing basically nothing. They had the same brains we do, probably the same vocal apparatus, the same hands capable of extraordinary dexterity. But their toolkits barely changed. Their behaviours remained static. They lived in small groups, made simple stone tools, hunted and gathered, and left almost no evidence of the complex symbolic thinking that defines humanity today. Then, around 100,000 BCE, something changed. Something profound and mysterious that anthropologists call the cognitive revolution. And nobody knows exactly what caused it. The archaeological record from this period shows a sudden explosion of behavioural complexity. Not everywhere at once, not in a straight line, but in scattered bursts across different parts of Africa. Sites that had shown simple, unchanging tool assemblages for thousands of years suddenly start producing evidence of something new. Abstract thinking, symbolic behaviour, culture. Take Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa. Around 100,000 years ago, the people living in this cave started doing something no human had ever done before, at least not in any way that left archaeological evidence. They began creating geometric patterns on pieces of ochre, a red mineral pigment. Not random scratches, deliberate, repeated patterns, crosshatches, lines, designs that required planning and intent. Why would anyone do this? Ochre doesn't make your spear sharper. It doesn't help you find food or build shelter. Creating patterns on pieces of rock serves no immediate survival function whatsoever. This is symbolic behavior. Abstract thinking, the ability to conceive of meaning beyond the purely practical. And here's what makes it even more remarkable. These weren't isolated individuals. Multiple people at Blombos were creating similar patterns over spans of centuries. This means they were teaching each other, passing down traditions, creating shared cultural meanings that transcended individual lifetimes. This is what makes humans different. Not tool use. Plenty of animals use tools. Not even complex cognition. Neanderthals had that too. What makes us unique is our ability to create shared symbolic systems, to agree collectively that certain things mean something beyond their physical properties, and to pass these meanings down through generations. But the ochre engravings were just the beginning. Around the same time, sites across Africa start showing evidence of personal ornamentation. Shell beads with holes drilled through them, clearly meant to be strung together and worn. These shells weren't found near the caves. They came from the coast, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Someone travelled immense distances to collect specific shells, brought them back, carefully drilled holes in them, and created jewellery. Think about what this means. These people cared about appearance, about status, about signalling something to others in their group. They had developed a sense of self-awareness sophisticated enough to worry about how others perceived them. They understood that objects could carry social meaning, that wearing certain things could communicate information about who you were and where you belonged. This is the dawn of culture as we know it, and it's happening in scattered pockets across Africa around 100,000 BCE. Now let's talk about the world these early behaviourally modern humans were living in, because understanding their environment is crucial to understanding why the cognitive revolution happened when it did. 100,000 years ago, Africa was not a hospitable place. The planet was locked in a glacial period. Massive ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, and even though Africa wasn't directly glaciated, the climate effects were devastating. The Sahara, which today is the world's largest hot desert, was even more extreme. Rainfall patterns across the continent were erratic and unpredictable. Lakes that existed for millennia could dry up in a generation. Rivers that sustained entire populations could vanish. Your ancestors weren't living in some tropical paradise. They were struggling to survive in a landscape that could turn deadly without warning. Resources were scarce and patchily distributed. Animal populations fluctuated wildly. Plant foods that had sustained groups for generations could disappear during extended droughts. Under these conditions, intelligence wasn't just advantageous, it was essential. Groups that could innovate, that could remember where water sources were during droughts, that could develop new hunting strategies when prey animals migrated, that could process foods that other groups couldn't. Those groups survived. The others didn't. Natural selection was operating at maximum intensity, and it was selecting for exactly the kinds of cognitive abilities we see emerging in the archaeological record around 100,000 BCE. But here's where things get really interesting. Your ancestors around 100,000 BCE weren't alone. They were sharing the world with at least 3 other human species, and possibly more. Neanderthals were already well established in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans were spreading across Eastern Asia. And Homo erectus, the remarkably successful species that had been around for nearly 2 million years, was still hanging on in pockets of Southeast Asia. This wasn't like today, where Homo sapiens is the only human species on the planet. This was a world of multiple human species, all competing for resources, all adapted to different environments, all following their own evolutionary trajectories. The Neanderthals, by this point, were already master survivors. They had been living in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They had larger brains than your ancestors, stronger bodies, sophisticated tool technologies. They hunted massive Ice Age mammals using coordinated group tactics. They controlled fire with precision. They buried their dead. By any reasonable measure, they were at least as successful as your early modern human ancestors, probably more so. The Denisovans remain mysterious because they left so few fossils, but genetic evidence shows they were incredibly diverse and widespread. Some populations had adapted to high altitudes. Others apparently developed seafaring capabilities. They were innovating and spreading just as successfully as any other human species. So why did your ancestors, these early behaviorally modern humans stumbling around Africa, eventually outlive all these other species? What did they have that the others didn't? The answer seems to be in how they organized themselves socially. And this brings us to one of the most important and least understood aspects of life 100,000 years ago: social structure. Your ancestors lived in small nomadic bands, probably 25 to 50 individuals, extended family groups that moved constantly across vast territories following seasonal resources. But unlike other human species, these bands weren't isolated. The archaeological evidence suggests they maintained connections with other groups, sometimes over hundreds of miles. Those shell beads from distant coastlines, they weren't just jewellery, they were evidence of trade networks, of sustained contact between groups separated by enormous distances. Someone was travelling these routes, maintaining relationships, exchanging goods and information. This is where complex language becomes crucial. You can't maintain far-flung social networks without sophisticated communication. You need to negotiate, to make promises, to create agreements that hold across time and space. You need to tell stories about distant groups, to maintain kinship relationships with people you might only see once every few years. The development of fully modern language around 100,000 BCE gave your ancestors an unprecedented ability to cooperate across large distances. They could share detailed information about resource locations, about dangers, about innovative techniques for making tools or processing foods. When one group discovered something useful, that knowledge could spread across an entire region within a generation. Neanderthals almost certainly had language too, probably quite sophisticated. But genetic evidence suggests their populations were more isolated, less interconnected. They lived in smaller, more autonomous groups. This made them incredibly effective in their local environments, but limited their ability to share innovations across their entire species. Your ancestors were building something different. Not just groups, but networks. Not just families, but exchange systems that could move information and resources across entire continents. This social technology, this ability to cooperate at scale, would eventually prove more important than any physical advantage. But daily life for these early behaviorally modern humans was still brutally hard. Let's get specific about what existence actually looked like around 100,000 BCE. You're born into a band of maybe 40 people. Most of them are related to you. Your mother's sisters, your father's brothers, your cousins, your grandparents, if you're lucky enough that they're still alive, which isn't common. Life expectancy is probably around 35 years, but that's misleading because infant mortality is catastrophic. If you survive to age 5, you might make it to 50 or 60. But getting to age 5 is a dangerous journey. Your band moves constantly. You never stay in one place for more than a few weeks, maybe a couple months at most. You're following animal migrations, tracking seasonal plant foods, moving between water sources. Everything you own has to be portable. Your entire material culture probably weighs less than 30 pounds. Your toolkit is surprisingly sophisticated. By 100,000 BCE, African humans are making what archaeologists call Middle Stone Age implements. These aren't the crude choppers of earlier humans. These are carefully crafted stone blades, some of them pressure flaked to create razor-sharp edges, spear points designed for specific prey animals, scrapers for processing hides, burins for working bone and wood. Some of these tools required hours to make. You had to find the right type of stone, understand its fracture properties, carefully shape it through multiple stages of reduction. This required teaching and learning, master craftspeople passing skills to apprentices. This required patience and planning. the ability to envision the finished tool before you even started making it. But tools weren't the only technology. Your ancestors around 100,000 BCE were also masters of fire, not just using it, but creating it reliably. They understood which woods burned best, how to maintain embers overnight, how to use smoke to preserve meat and hides. Fire gave them the ability to cook foods that would otherwise be inedible, to extend their diet into root vegetables and tough plant materials that other animals couldn't process. Fire also created social space. When darkness fell, which in Africa near the equator happens suddenly and completely, the fire became the center of life. This is where the band gathered, where food was shared, where stories were told. This is where children learned the skills and knowledge they would need to survive. This is where the complex social bonds that held the group together were maintained and reinforced, and it's probably where the earliest forms of spirituality emerged, because by 100,000 BCE, your ancestors were beginning to grapple with questions that had no practical answers. What happens when we die? Why do the animals migrate? What are the stars? Where did we come from? The evidence for early spirituality is subtle and contested. We don't find elaborate burial sites or obvious religious structures from this period. But we find those ochre engravings. We find shell beads. We find evidence of behaviors that serve no immediate practical purpose, but that seem to be imbued with meaning. Some researchers think the ochre patterns might have been linked to trance states, possibly induced through dance or rhythmic chanting. That these early humans were beginning to explore altered states of consciousness, seeking connections to something beyond the immediate physical world. Others point to the careful curation of certain objects. Unusual stones, fossils, crystals collected and kept not for their utility, but for their aesthetic or symbolic properties. These collections suggest an awareness that some things matter beyond their practical function, that beauty and meaning exist independently of survival. This is self-awareness at a profound level. Not just knowing that you exist, but wondering why you exist. Not just experiencing emotions, but reflecting on those experiences. Not just living, but asking what it means to live. And all of this cognitive revolution, this explosion of symbolic behavior, this dawn of culture and spirituality, is happening in scattered pockets across Africa around 100,000 BCE. Not everywhere, not all at once, but spreading, innovating, creating the behavioral toolkit that would eventually allow humanity to colonize the entire planet. Your ancestors during this 10,000-year window weren't yet the dominant species. They were still struggling, still competing with other humans and with the brutal African climate. Many bands went extinct, many innovations were lost, many brilliant ideas died with the individuals who conceived them, but the network held. The social connections, the exchange systems, the ability to share information across distances that kept humanity moving forward even when individual groups failed. And slowly, generation by generation, the cognitive and cultural tools that define modern humans were being assembled. What happened next would test these tools to their absolute limit, because your ancestors were about to face challenges that would either destroy them completely or forge them into something unprecedented in Earth's history. The question was simple. Were they ready? So let's talk about what your ancestors actually did all day. Because here's the thing that might surprise you. For most of the Paleolithic, life wasn't the brutal, desperate struggle we imagine. Yes, there were hard times. Yes, people died young by modern standards. But on average, when resources were decent and the climate wasn't actively trying to kill everyone, your Paleolithic ancestors worked less than you do. A lot less. The best estimates from modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest that Paleolithic humans spent maybe 15 to 20 hours per week on what we'd call subsistence activities. Hunting, gathering, food processing, tool making. That's it. The rest of the time, socializing, playing, telling stories, making art, sleeping, teaching children, maintaining relationships. They had what we might call leisure, except they didn't distinguish between work and leisure the way we do. Life was life, not something divided into productive hours and free time. Picture a typical day. You wake up not to an alarm but to the first light filtering through the entrance of your rock shelter or the walls of your constructed dwelling. The fire in the centre of your living space has burned down to coals during the night, but it's never completely out. Someone, usually whoever woke first, has already added fuel and gotten it blazing again. Fire management is a 24-hour responsibility shared by everyone old enough to handle it safely. The morning air is cool, even in summer. You're somewhere in what will eventually be called southern France, though those names mean nothing to you. What matters is that this territory has a good spring, plenty of game animals, and several productive gathering sites within a day's walk. Your group of about 30 people has been using this location seasonally for generations, maybe centuries. Your grandparents knew this place, and their grandparents before them. The first order of business is breakfast, but that's not what you'd recognize as a meal. Some dried meat from yesterday's hunt gets passed around. Someone's already been out and collected fresh greens, bitter stuff that your modern descendants would probably hate, but that provides nutrients your body craves. There might be some leftover roasted roots from last night. You eat while sitting around the fire, talking in low voices, planning the day. And here's where the division of labour gets interesting. Because contrary to popular mythology, Paleolithic life wasn't strictly divided into men hunt, women gather. The reality was way more flexible and way more sophisticated. Yes, men did most of the large game hunting, especially the dangerous kind that involved tracking megafauna for days or facing down animals that could kill you. But women hunted too, particularly smaller game, rabbits, birds, anything that could be caught near the home base. Recent archaeological findings have completely overturned the old assumptions. We found women buried with hunting weapons. Analysis of skeletal remains shows women with the same throwing injuries as male hunters. Evidence of a life spent launching spears and atlatl darts. But the real power in Paleolithic societies, that was in gathering. And gathering was primarily, though not exclusively, women's domain. Here's why this mattered so much. In most environments, gathered foods provided 60 to 80% of the calories consumed by the group. Meat was important, absolutely. It provided crucial proteins and fats, but it was also unpredictable. Hunts failed. Animals migrated. Weather made tracking impossible. Gathered foods, plant roots, nuts, seeds, fruits, insects, shellfish, eggs. These were the reliable foundation of survival. And the knowledge required to gather effectively was staggering. Think about what a skilled gatherer needed to know. Which of the hundreds of plant species in your territory were edible, which were poisonous, which were medicinal, when each plant was in season, and where to find it. How to process toxic plants to make them safe, like leaching bitter tannins from acorns or preparing cassava roots. Which insects were nutritious and how to harvest them efficiently. Where bird nests were likely to be, and when eggs would be available, which shellfish beds were productive and when the tides made them accessible. This knowledge took years to acquire and was constantly being updated and refined. Young girls would start learning from their mothers and grandmothers and aunts, practically from the moment they could walk. They'd learn to identify plants, to understand animal behaviour, to read the landscape for signs of food and water and danger. By the time a woman reached adulthood, she carried in her head an encyclopedia of ecological knowledge that took a lifetime to master completely. And this knowledge was shared. Constantly. Women would go out gathering in groups, not just for safety, but for teaching and information exchange. They'd discuss new food sources they'd discovered, warn about areas where resources were depleted, share techniques for processing difficult foods. This informal knowledge network was arguably more important to group survival than any individual hunting success. The men heading out to hunt faced different challenges. Tracking large game required different skills. Reading footprints and droppings to determine how recently an animal had passed. Understanding animal behavior well enough to predict movement. Having the patience to follow trails for hours or days. And the coordination to work with other hunters to bring down dangerous prey. A successful mammoth hunt could feed the entire group for weeks, but it might require days of tracking and dangerous close-quarters combat with an animal that weighed 6 tons and could easily kill you. But here's what's really interesting. Child-rearing in Paleolithic societies was communal in a way that would shock most modern parents. Your child wasn't just your responsibility. They were everyone's responsibility. The whole group had a stake in making sure the next generation survived and learned, and eventually contributed to group survival. Babies were carried constantly by mothers, of course, but also by older siblings, grandparents, aunts, unrelated adults. Archaeological evidence suggests Paleolithic women had longer intervals between births than modern humans in agricultural societies, probably around 4 years. This meant that each child received intense attention and care during their early years. They were nursed for 2 or 3 years, carried and held constantly, never left to cry alone because isolation meant danger. As children grew older, they had what we might call an extended childhood. Human children take longer to mature than almost any other mammal, and this was true in the Paleolithic too. But this long childhood wasn't wasted time. It was an intensive learning period where children absorbed the massive amounts of cultural knowledge they'd need to survive as adults. Young children learned through play, imitating adult activities. They'd make toy tools and pretend to hunt or gather. They'd help with simple tasks, collecting firewood, fetching water, watching younger children. Older children and adolescents would begin participating in real subsistence activities, but always under supervision. Teenage girls would join gathering expeditions. Teenage boys would go on hunts, though they'd be in support roles at first. The elders, your grandparents and great-grandparents, if you were lucky enough to have them, were absolutely crucial to this system. They were the libraries of their societies, the keepers of knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. An elder who had lived through 60 or 70 years had experienced climate events that only happened once in a lifetime. They knew what to do when the salmon didn't run, or when the usual plant foods failed. They remembered locations of backup water sources and alternative territories. They taught the young and advised the adults and told stories that encoded survival information in memorable forms. And then there was fire. Fire was everything. It was technology, social center, protection, and transformer of food all rolled into one. By the time we're talking about, humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years, but they'd become absolute masters of it. Fire starting was a skill every adult possessed. The bow drill method, where you create friction by spinning a stick against a wooden base, was probably the most common technique. But your ancestors also knew how to use stone-on-stone striking to create sparks, how to preserve embers in wrapped bundles of slow-burning fungus that could keep fire alive for days while travelling. Fire wasn't just for cooking, though cooking was revolutionary enough on its own. Cooking made foods digestible that would otherwise be toxic or inedible. It killed parasites in meat. It broke down plant cell walls, making nutrients more accessible. It allowed humans to extract more calories from food with less digestive effort, which might have been one of the factors that allowed human brains to grow so large. Big brains are energy hogs. Cooked food provided the fuel. But fire also extended the day. When the sun went down, most animals bedded down for the night or became vulnerable prey for nocturnal predators. Humans kept the fire burning and sat around it, talking, working on tools, telling stories. this time after dark was crucial for social bonding and information sharing. Around the fire, elders would teach, adults would plan, and children would learn the stories that gave meaning to their world. Fire provided protection too. Most large predators were wary of it. A group camping in the open with a good fire was relatively safe from lions, cave bears, or hyenas. This allowed humans to use territories that would otherwise be too dangerous, expanding their range and flexibility. And fire allowed humans to shape their environment. Controlled burns could drive game animals toward hunters or promote the growth of useful plants. Fire could be used to harden wooden spear points. Smoke from fires could preserve meat or cure hides. In colder climates, fire was literally the difference between life and death during winter. As for shelter, the popular image of cave-dwelling primitives is only partially accurate. Yes, caves were used when available. They provided ready-made protection from weather and predators, but caves weren't common everywhere, and even where they existed, they weren't always safe. Cave bears might already be living there. Flooding could be a risk. Smoke accumulation from fires could be a problem, so humans built shelters. The archaeological record shows constructed dwellings going back at least 400,000 years, and they were remarkably sophisticated. In warmer climates, you'd see simple windbreaks and shade structures made from branches and leaves. In colder areas, more substantial buildings using wood frames covered with hides. Some groups built semi-subterranean pit houses, digging into the earth for insulation and building frameworks over the top. In Siberia, where wood was scarce but mammoths were common, people built structures using mammoth bones and tusks as the framework, covering them with hides weighted down with more bones. These weren't temporary camps thrown together in an hour. Major dwelling sites show evidence of long-term occupation, sometimes seasonal use over many generations. Some structures are designated sleeping areas, work areas, and storage areas. They had carefully constructed hearths with stones arranged to reflect heat. Some even had what archaeologists think might have been primitive smoke management systems, ways to direct smoke out while keeping heat in. And then there's clothing, another technology that's older than you might think. By 70,000 years ago, humans were definitely wearing tailored clothing. We know this from the archaeological appearance of specialized hide-working tools, and from genetic analysis of body lice, which split into head lice and clothing lice right around this period. But clothing was probably being used much earlier, especially by populations moving into colder climates. Early clothing was made from animal hides, carefully scraped and treated to make them soft and durable. This was skilled work, requiring knowledge of which animals provided the best skins, how to remove the hide without damaging it, and how to process it so it wouldn't rot or become stiff. The process involved scraping away fat and tissue, treating the hide with animal brains or other substances to preserve it, and then working it until it was soft and flexible. But clothing was more than just protection from cold. It was one of humanity's first forms of artistic expression and social signalling. Even in the Paleolithic, people were decorating their clothing with shells, beads, and coloured pigments. They were creating distinctive styles that marked group identity. Clothing said something about who you were, which group you belonged to, maybe even your status within that group. Because here's the deeper truth about Paleolithic life. It was fundamentally social. Everything, from food procurement to child rearing to shelter construction to clothing production, was embedded in networks of relationships and reciprocal obligations. You survived not just because you were strong or smart or skilled, but because you were part of a group that shared resources and knowledge and labour. The lone survivor is a myth. Humans survived together or not at all, and these weren't just survival partnerships. They were rich social worlds full of relationships, conflicts, alliances, friendships, love affairs, rivalries. Your ancestors gossiped and laughed and argued and made up. They had personalities and preferences and quirks. They weren't simple or primitive. They were fully human, just living in a different world with different tools, a world that was about to change in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. So let's talk about what happened next. Because around 70,000 years ago, something changed in the behavior of a small group of humans living somewhere in East Africa. They started walking, and they kept walking and walking. And by the time their descendants finally stopped, they had colonized every habitable continent on Earth. This is the Great Migration, the moment when humans stopped being an African species and became a global one. But here's what makes this story so fascinating. It didn't happen because they wanted adventure. It didn't happen because they were curious about what lay beyond the horizon. It happened because they had no choice. Picture the situation. You're part of a band of maybe 30, 40 people living along the coast of what's now Ethiopia or Somalia. Your ancestors have lived in this region for thousands of years. You know every water source, every seasonal fruiting tree, every game trail. This is your territory, your home. But slowly, year by year, things are getting worse. The climate is shifting again. Not as catastrophically as the Great Bottleneck, but enough to matter. Rainfall patterns are changing. Some regions that were reliable are becoming unpredictable. And most critically, population pressure is building, because humans are getting better at survival, better tools, better hunting strategies, more sophisticated social cooperation. All the innovations developed during the recovery period are paying off. And that means more people, more mouths to feed, more competition for the same resources. So some groups make a decision. They start exploring the margins, the edges of known territory, and some of them, maybe by accident, maybe deliberately, cross a narrow strait of water between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. It's not that far, maybe 20 miles at the narrowest point. On a clear day, you can see the other side. They probably used simple watercraft, rafts made of bundled reeds, maybe logs lashed together. Nothing sophisticated, just enough to get across, and suddenly they're in a whole new world. The Arabian Peninsula 70,000 years ago looks nothing like today's desert. The climate is wetter, more temperate. There are rivers, lakes, grasslands teeming with game. And most importantly, there are no other humans. No competition, no territorial disputes, just endless resources waiting to be exploited. For a small group of pioneers, this is paradise. So they stay, they settle, they have children. Those children grow up and start exploring further, and the process repeats, generation after generation, always pushing a little further into unoccupied territory, always following the coastline because that's where resources are most abundant and predictable. This is called the coastal migration theory, and it's supported by both genetic and archaeological evidence. These early migrants didn't strike out across the interior of Asia. They followed the coast, walking along beaches, living off shellfish, seabirds, and whatever terrestrial game they could find inland. It was a conservative strategy, but it worked. Following the coastline meant they always knew where they were, always had access to water and food, could never get completely lost, and it was fast. Well, fast in geological terms. Within maybe 10,000 or 15,000 years, their descendants had reached all the way to Australia. That's roughly 8,000 miles from the starting point in Africa. They walked the entire southern coast of Asia, through what's now India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia. And then they did something absolutely remarkable. They built boats capable of crossing open ocean. Because here's the thing about reaching Australia. There's no land bridge. There never has been, not during any ice age, not during any period of human prehistory. The minimum water gap has always been at least 60 miles of open ocean. You can't see the other side. You can't island hop all the way. At some point you have to commit to sailing across water where you cannot see land in any direction. This requires cognitive sophistication that scientists used to think early humans didn't possess. You need to understand navigation, weather patterns, ocean currents. You need to build watercraft sturdy enough to survive open ocean conditions. You need to provision for a journey that might take days, and you need to have the courage, or perhaps the desperation, to sail into the unknown with no guarantee you'll find anything on the other side. But they did it. By 65,000 years ago, maybe earlier, humans had reached Australia. We know because that's how old the earliest archaeological sites are. Stone tools, hearths, remains of meals, evidence of people who had made one of the greatest maritime voyages in human history using technology that was supposedly primitive. And once they reached Australia, they spread across the continent in just a few thousand years. From the tropical north to the temperate south, from coastal regions to the arid interior. They adapted to environments that were completely alien to anything their African ancestors had ever experienced. Megafauna that existed nowhere else. Plants that were poisonous or required special processing. Seasons that worked backwards from what they'd known in the northern hemisphere. They figured it all out, learned which animals to hunt, which plants to eat, how to find water in seemingly barren landscapes. Within a few dozen generations, they had developed entirely new toolkits, new hunting strategies, new social organizations perfectly adapted to Australian conditions. This is the signature of human adaptability. Drop us in any environment and given enough time, we'll not just survive, we'll thrive. But while some groups were pushing into Australia, others were taking different paths. Some migrants had stayed behind in the Middle East. Instead of continuing east along the coast, they turned north, moving into the Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria. And there, around 60,000 years ago, they encountered something unexpected. Other humans who looked different, talked different, had different tools and different customs, the Neanderthals. Now remember, Neanderthals weren't primitive cavemen. They were a sophisticated human species that had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They had complex tools, sophisticated hunting strategies, symbolic culture. They were perfectly adapted to their environments. And suddenly, here come these African migrants pushing into their territory. What happened next changed human history. Because instead of all-out conflict, instead of one group exterminating the other, something more complicated occurred. They interbred. We know this because every modern human of non-African descent carries Neanderthal DNA. Not a lot, usually about 2%, but it's there. Evidence of encounters, relationships, children born of mixed parentage. The genetic evidence suggests these encounters happened multiple times, in multiple locations, over thousands of years. This wasn't a one-time event. This was sustained contact between two human species, and it wasn't just genetic material being exchanged. Modern humans entering Europe show evidence of adopting some Neanderthal technologies, certain tool types, hunting strategies, even possibly some aspects of symbolic culture. Similarly, late Neanderthal sites sometimes show technologies that look suspiciously like modern human innovations. This is cultural exchange, learning from each other, adapting ideas from another human species and incorporating them into your own survival toolkit. But it wasn't all cooperation. There was competition too. Both species were apex predators. Both needed the same large game animals, the same cave shelters, the same territories. As modern humans pushed further into Europe, Neanderthal populations began to decline. Not suddenly, not all at once, but steadily over thousands of years. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were restricted to isolated refuges in southern Europe. By 30,000 years ago, they were gone entirely. Did modern humans hunt them to extinction? Outcompete them for resources, bring diseases they couldn't resist? We don't know, probably all of the above. What we do know is that modern humans succeeded where Neanderthals ultimately failed. We survived. They didn't. But they left their mark in our genes, evidence that we're not purely one species, but a hybrid carrying genetic material from multiple human lineages. While this drama was playing out in Europe, other groups were still migrating. Some had moved into Central Asia, encountering yet another human species, the Denisovans, more interbreeding, more genetic exchange. Modern populations in Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA, some groups as much as 5%. Particularly advantageous genes got preserved and spread. That high-altitude adaptation we mentioned earlier. Thank Denisovan ancestors for that. Genetic variants that help process oxygen in thin mountain air, still helping Tibetan populations today, 50,000 years after the original interbreeding event. Other groups pushed further north and east, following game animals into increasingly cold environments. By 45,000 years ago, humans had reached the Arctic Circle. By 30,000 years ago, they were living in Siberia, enduring winters that would kill modern humans without specialized equipment. But they survived, developed clothing made from animal skins, learned to build insulated shelters, figured out how to hunt Arctic megafauna. They created entirely new survival strategies for environments that seemed fundamentally uninhabitable. And then they kept going. Because during the ice ages, so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped dramatically. This exposed a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, a 1,000-mile wide expanse of tundra that geologists call Beringia, and sometime between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, groups of humans crossed it and entered the Americas. We used to think this happened earlier, but the genetic and archaeological evidence keeps pushing the date later. What we know now is that the initial colonization of the Americas probably happened relatively quickly. Within maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years, human groups had spread from Alaska all the way to the southern tip of South America. That's over 10,000 miles in less than 100 generations. It's one of the fastest expansions in human history, and like everywhere else, they adapted to North American forests and plains, to Central American jungles, to South American mountains and rainforests, to every ecological niche the Americas offered. They developed new tools for new prey, learned to exploit entirely novel food sources, created societies adapted to environments their ancestors couldn't have imagined. By 12,000 years ago, humans had reached Tierra del Fuego, the islands at the southern tip of South America. From East Africa to the edge of Antarctica, humans had colonized every habitable continent. We had spread from the tropics to the Arctic, from sea level to high mountains, from rainforests to deserts. We had become a truly global species. But here's what's really remarkable. This entire process took about 60,000 years. From the first groups leaving Africa to the final colonization of the Americas, 600 centuries. That's incredibly slow. Modern humans could walk from Africa to South America in a few years if they wanted to. Even allowing for detours and difficult terrain, you could do it in a decade or two. So why did it take our ancestors 60,000 years? Because they weren't trying to explore. They were trying to survive. Each group occupied territories that worked, that provided sufficient resources. They only moved when they had to, when population pressure forced them into marginal areas, when climate shifts made old territories unreliable. Movement was a response to necessity, not curiosity. And this conservatism made sense. If you've developed a successful survival strategy for your current environment, changing it is dangerous. Moving into new territory means learning new resources, new dangers, new seasonal patterns. It means your accumulated knowledge becomes less useful. Your elders can't tell you which plants are edible or where the game migrates because they don't know either. Every move is a risk. so you only take that risk when staying becomes riskier than leaving. But the genetic evidence tells us something else too. These migrating populations maintained contact with each other. We can see it in DNA. Gene flow between groups separated by thousands of miles, evidence of trade networks, marriage exchanges, information sharing across vast distances. The human expansion wasn't one group marching straight from Africa to Australia. It was a network of interconnected populations, each adapting to local conditions but still part of a larger whole. This network would prove crucial, because the next chapter in human history wasn't just about survival. It was about creating something entirely new, something that would separate us definitively from every other species on Earth. Culture, symbolic thought, art, the capacity to imagine things that don't exist and then bring them into being. And that's where our story goes next. Now we need to talk about something that will fundamentally change your understanding of what it means to be human. Because around 40,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Your ancestors, those hardened survivors who had already endured ice ages and droughts and near extinction, they suddenly started doing something that had never been done before in the history of life on Earth. They started making art, not just scratches on rocks, not just random marks, but sophisticated, intentional, breathtaking art that would still move you to tears if you saw it today. The evidence is everywhere once you know where to look. Deep in the caves of southern France, at Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, your ancestors descended into the earth with primitive oil lamps and started painting. Horses galloping across stone walls, bison charging in herds, lions hunting, bears standing upright. The images are so vivid, so full of movement and life, that modern artists study them to understand composition and form. But here's what really stops you in your tracks. These weren't amateur scribbles by people who had nothing better to do. These were masterworks created by individuals who understood perspective, shading, and the use of the natural contours of the cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. Some images used the curve of the rock to make animals appear to move as the lamplight flickered across them. These people were artists in the truest sense, skilled, trained, probably specialists who spent years perfecting their craft. And they were painting in the darkest, most remote chambers of these cave systems. Places you had to crawl through narrow passages to reach. Places that took hours to access. Places that were, for all practical purposes, cut off from the world of daylight and daily survival. Why? That's the question that haunts archaeologists. Why would people living on the edge of survival, people who had to hunt or forage every single day just to eat, why would they spend precious time and resources creating art that almost nobody would ever see? The answer tells us something profound about what had changed in the human mind. Your ancestors had developed the capacity for symbolic thinking, the ability to see meaning beyond the immediate physical world. That horse on the wall wasn't just a horse, it was an idea, a story, possibly a prayer or a wish for successful hunting. It was proof that humans had learned to live in two worlds simultaneously, the physical world of survival and the mental world of meaning. But the cave paintings were just the beginning. Evidence from sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia shows that humans around this time became obsessed with decoration, personal adornment, making themselves beautiful, not for survival, but for something else entirely. Social status, tribal identity, simple aesthetic pleasure. Ochre, a red mineral pigment, shows up at archaeological sites from this period in massive quantities, tons of it, ground into powder, mixed with fat or water to create paint. But they weren't just painting cave walls. They were painting themselves, their bodies, their faces, their clothing, creating the world's first cosmetics, the first makeup, the first fashion. Some burial sites from this period show individuals covered in ochre so extensively that the soil around them is stained red even 30,000 years later. This wasn't random. This was intentional, ritualized, meaningful. These people were making statements about identity, about who they were and what group they belonged to. Beads appear too. Thousands upon thousands of beads carved from shells, bones, stones, ivory, each one requiring hours of patient work to drill and shape, strung together into necklaces, bracelets, decorative clothing. Some individuals were buried with elaborate beadwork that must have represented years of collected wealth and status. And then there's the music. Because yes, your ancestors were making music. Bone flutes have been found at sites across Europe, carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory, dating back 40,000 years. These aren't crude noisemakers. They're sophisticated instruments, with carefully placed finger holes designed to produce specific notes. They show that humans had developed an understanding of pitch, scale, and melody. Play a reproduction of one of these ancient flutes and you hear something haunting. Simple melodies, yes, but recognizably musical. The same basic scales that would eventually evolve into all human music traditions. Your ancestors were sitting around fires on cold prehistoric nights, playing flutes, probably singing, maybe dancing, creating beauty for its own sake. But the most profound cultural development of this period was something quieter, more intimate, and ultimately more revealing of human emotional complexity. Burial practices. Humans had been burying their dead for a long time. Neanderthals did it. Early modern humans did it. But around 40,000 years ago, burials became elaborate, ritualized, full of meaning that we can still read today. Bodies were placed in specific positions, fetal positions suggesting rebirth, facing certain directions, perhaps toward ancestral homelands or sacred places, buried with grave goods, tools, weapons, ornaments, food, provisions for a journey. This means your ancestors believed in an afterlife. They had developed the concept that death wasn't an ending but a transition, that the person who died was going somewhere and would need things for the journey. This is sophisticated abstract thinking. This is philosophy. This is the birth of religion. Some burials show even more complexity. At one site in Russia, 2 children were buried together, covered in thousands of ivory beads, with elaborate carved figurines placed around them. The amount of work represented by those grave goods is staggering. Months, maybe years of skilled labour, all buried with children who died young and contributed nothing economically to their community. This tells us something crucial. These people loved their dead, not just as useful members of a survival group, but as individuals worthy of honour and remembrance. They experienced grief profound enough to motivate elaborate ritual. They believed their dead deserved dignity. And they were probably experiencing something else, something that anthropologists call shamanism, though that word barely captures what was happening. Trance states, altered consciousness, spiritual experiences that felt more real than everyday reality. The cave paintings give us clues. Some images show strange hybrid creatures, human figures with animal heads, beings that don't exist in the natural world, geometric patterns that might represent visions seen in altered states, handprints, hundreds of them, left by people who pressed their hands against cave walls as if reaching through to another dimension. Many archaeologists now think these deep cave chambers were used for ritual purposes. Shamans or spiritual leaders would descend into the earth, into the darkness, possibly using rhythmic drumming or chanting or psychoactive plants to induce trance states. In those altered states of consciousness, they would see visions, spirit animals, ancestral beings, the hidden structure of reality. And then they would paint what they saw on the cave walls, creating a permanent record of their spiritual journeys. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was systematic exploration of human consciousness. Your ancestors had discovered that the mind could be altered, that there were other ways of perceiving reality beyond ordinary waking awareness. And they were using these techniques to access knowledge, to heal, to communicate with something they perceived as sacred. But perhaps the most important cultural practice that developed during this period was something that left no physical trace: storytelling. The oral traditions that preserved knowledge across generations, that turned individual experiences into collective wisdom, that created shared identity among people who might never meet. Every society we know of has origin stories, myths about where they came from, how the world was created, why things are the way they are. These stories probably emerged during this period, passed down parent to child to grandchild for hundreds of generations. Some Australian Aboriginal oral traditions can be verified against geological events that happened 10,000 years ago. The stories preserved accurate information for 400 generations. Your ancestors were doing this, creating narratives that explained their world, teaching survival skills through memorable tales, maintaining knowledge of distant places and past events through story, building shared identity around common narratives. Language had evolved beyond simple communication into something transformative, a technology for storing and transmitting culture. And then there are the Venus figurines, small carved figures of women found across Europe and Asia, dating from roughly 30,000 to 20,000 years ago. They show female bodies with exaggerated features, large breasts, wide hips, prominent stomachs, faces usually featureless or highly stylized. Nobody knows for certain what they meant. Were they fertility symbols, representations of goddesses, portraits of real women, teaching tools for midwifery? The fact that similar figures appear across thousands of miles suggests they had some widespread cultural significance. Some researchers think they represent an early form of religion, centered on female fertility and the cycles of life. Others argue they were simply realistic depictions of what healthy women looked like in societies where food was scarce and weight gain was rare. Still others suggest they were self-portraits, carved by women looking down at their own bodies. What we do know is that your ancestors were thinking symbolically about human reproduction, about femininity, about the creative power of life. They were developing complex ideas about gender, fertility, and the sacred nature of birth. All of these developments, the art, the music, the ritual, the storytelling, the symbolic representations, they weren't separate phenomena. They were all expressions of the same fundamental shift in human consciousness. Your ancestors had learned to think abstractly, to see meaning beyond the immediate and physical, to create culture that could accumulate across generations. And this changed everything. Because once you can think symbolically, once you can create shared meanings through art and ritual and story, you can coordinate human behavior on an entirely new scale. You can maintain cooperation between strangers who share symbols even if they've never met. You can preserve knowledge indefinitely through oral tradition. You can motivate people to achieve long-term goals through shared beliefs and values. This was the birth of true human culture, not just survival strategies passed down genetically or through simple imitation, but elaborate systems of meaning that existed primarily in the mind. Systems that could evolve faster than genes, that could adapt to new circumstances within a single generation. Your ancestors weren't just surviving anymore. They were creating worlds of meaning, building societies held together by shared stories and symbols, exploring consciousness and spirituality and art, becoming, for the first time, fully human in the sense we understand today. And they, We're about to put all these new cultural capacities to use. Because the next great challenge was coming, and this time it wouldn't be about surviving environmental catastrophe. It would be about something far more complex. Learning to live together in larger and larger groups without tearing themselves apart. Building the social structures that would eventually become civilization. Here's something that will blow your mind. Your ancestors spent 90,000 years before civilization, and for most of that time they were using essentially the same basic stone tools. Hand axes, scrapers, simple spear points, generation after generation, millennium after millennium making the same tools their great-great-great-grandparents made. To our modern minds, constantly bombarded by updates and upgrades, this seems incomprehensible. Why didn't they innovate faster? Why did progress take so incredibly long? But here's the thing. When you're living on the edge of survival, innovation is dangerous. You have a set of tools and techniques that work, that keep your family alive through harsh winters and dry seasons. Every member of your group knows how to make them, use them, maintain them. Now imagine you're some creative genius who invents something new. Something that might work better, but nobody's ever tried before. You're betting your life, and the lives of everyone who depends on you, on an untested idea. In a world where one bad hunting season means starvation, that's not creativity, that's recklessness. So innovation happened slowly, carefully, only when the benefits were so obvious, so immediately valuable, that the risk was worth taking. And when those innovations finally came, they weren't just improvements, they were revolutions. Take projectile weapons. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans hunted with thrusting spears. You had to get close to your prey, close enough to stab it, close enough to smell its fear, close enough for it to gore you with tusks or antlers or horns if something went wrong. The kill rate was decent if you were skilled and lucky. The injury rate was terrifying. Broken bones, torn muscles, infections that killed days later. Hunting was the most dangerous thing humans did, and they did it constantly because they had to eat. Then, sometime around 75,000 years ago, someone figured out the atlatl. It's basically a spear thrower, a stick with a hook at one end that acts as a lever extension for your arm. Simple physics, but revolutionary in application. Suddenly you could throw a spear with 3 times the force and twice the range. You could kill from 30 feet away instead of 3. The danger didn't disappear, but it dropped dramatically. And something else happened too. The increased range meant you could target smaller, faster animals that had been nearly impossible to hunt before. Your resource base expanded, your nutrition improved, your survival odds went up. But here's the wild part. The atlatl didn't spread instantly across the human world. Archaeological evidence shows it taking thousands of years to move from one region to another. Why? Because adoption required more than just seeing the tool. You had to learn a completely new throwing technique. You had to develop different hunting strategies. You had to convince your whole group to invest time in learning something new when the old methods were still working. Innovation wasn't just about invention. It was about persuasion, training, cultural change. The bow and arrow came much later, probably around 30,000 years ago. It offered even more advantages: faster shots, better accuracy, lighter ammunition. But it also required more sophisticated technology. Flexible wood for the bow, strong cordage for the string, perfectly balanced arrows with precisely shaped points. Making a functional bow and arrow set required expertise in multiple crafts. You couldn't just be a good stone knapper anymore. You needed to understand wood selection, fibre processing, and feather fletching. Technology was becoming specialised. Which brings us to microlith technology, and this is where things get really interesting. Around 70,000 years ago, humans started making tiny, precise stone blades. Not finished tools, but components. Small triangular or crescent-shaped pieces that could be hafted together into composite tools. A single wooden handle could hold multiple microliths, creating a saw blade or a harpoon with rows of sharp points. When one piece broke, you didn't throw away the whole tool, you just replaced the broken segment. This represents a massive cognitive leap. You're not making a tool anymore, you're engineering a tool system. You have to plan ahead, visualize the finished product, create standardized components that fit together properly. Archaeological sites show evidence of specialized microlith workshops, places where skilled artisans produce blades that will be distributed throughout the region. We're looking at the beginning of manufacturing, the birth of specialized crafts. But the most important technological revolution of the entire period was probably the one that left almost no archaeological trace. Rope, cordage, fiber technology, the invisible revolution that changed absolutely everything. Think about what you can do with rope that you can't do without it. You can tie things together, build rafts, make nets for fishing, create snares for trapping, construct shelters that don't collapse in the wind, carry heavy loads using slings and harnesses, pull sleds across ice and snow. Every single one of these capabilities opens up entirely new survival strategies. Coastal groups with fishing nets could exploit marine resources that had been unreachable. Arctic populations with rope-bound sledges could follow migrating herds across vast distances. Island communities with rafts could spread across archipelagos, colonizing new territories. The problem is, rope doesn't preserve. Plant fibers decay rapidly. We have only rare glimpses of this technology in the archaeological record. A few fragments preserved in waterlogged cave deposits, impressions on clay where cordage pressed against soft surfaces. But genetic evidence tells us something fascinating. Multiple human populations developed increased manual dexterity and finger strength around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Natural selection was favoring people with the physical capacity for detailed fiber work. This suggests rope making had become so important to survival that it was actually shaping human evolution. And rope enabled another invisible revolution: watercraft. Now, proving that ancient humans had boats is extraordinarily difficult because boats made from reeds, bark or animal skins leave essentially no trace in the archaeological record. But we know they existed because we have something better than artifacts. We have evidence of their consequences. Human populations on islands that were never connected to mainlands, even during Ice Age sea level drops. The only way to get there is by water, and it wasn't just close to shore island hopping. By 50,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia, which required crossing at least 60 miles of open ocean. That's not accidental raft blown off course. That's intentional navigation, planning. Probably multiple attempts with many failures. Early watercraft meant coastal populations could follow shorelines, exploiting marine resources. They could fish in deeper waters, collect shellfish from offshore rocks, transport heavy loads along coasts much more easily than overland. Some groups became specialized maritime people, their entire lifestyle built around the water, and those groups could move fast, much faster than inland populations walking across continents. When sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age and flooded coastal plains where these early maritime people lived, their settlements vanished under hundreds of feet of water. We're probably missing huge chunks of human history because the people who lived them chose coasts that are now underwater. Around 30,000 years ago, humans achieved something unprecedented. They made an alliance with another species, dogs. Or more accurately, wolves that were beginning to become dogs. We don't know exactly how it happened. Maybe wolves started hanging around human camps, scavenging refuse. Maybe humans deliberately captured wolf pups and raised them. Probably it was a gradual process with multiple false starts. but genetic evidence shows that by 30,000 years ago, there were canids that were genetically distinct from wild wolves, animals that had been shaped by association with humans. This partnership changed everything. Dogs could smell prey humans couldn't detect, hear threats approaching in the night, track wounded animals across vast distances. They provided early warning of predators, helped drive herds during hunts, even offered companionship and warmth during brutal winters. In return, they got food, protection, and a place in human social groups. It was the first time any human species had formed a mutually beneficial relationship with another large mammal, the first time we'd essentially co-evolved with another species, shaping them as they shaped us. But perhaps the most underappreciated innovation of this entire period was storage technology. Baskets, hide bags, probably wooden containers that haven't preserved. This sounds trivial until you realize what storage enables: the ability to save for later, to separate gathering from consumption, to transport resources from abundant areas to scarce ones, to weather bad seasons using stockpiles from good ones. Storage fundamentally changed human resource strategies. Instead of eating everything immediately, you could plan ahead. Collect massive amounts of seasonal resources, nuts ripening in autumn, fish running in streams, and preserve them for winter. Archaeological sites from around 40,000 years ago start showing evidence of seasonal occupation patterns. Groups establishing base camps with storage facilities, sending out foraging parties during abundant seasons, then returning to stored resources during lean times. This is sedentism before agriculture, the beginning of staying in one place because you've invested resources there. And storage required its own technological ecosystem. You need containers, which means basketry or pottery or sewn hides. You need preservation methods, drying, smoking, possibly fermentation, though that's harder to prove archaeologically. You need ways to protect stored food from scavengers and pests. Some groups dug storage pits lined with bark. Others built elevated platforms. The solutions were diverse, but the principle was universal. Save today to survive tomorrow. Then there's poison, plant knowledge, the beginning of chemistry. Somewhere along the way, humans figured out that certain plants could kill or paralyze animals much more effectively than any spear point. Poison arrow frogs in South America, plant toxins in Africa, venom-based compounds in Asia. We have archaeological evidence of poison use going back at least 40,000 years. Stone points with specialized grooves to hold toxic substances. Residue analysis showing plant alkaloids on ancient weapons. But developing useful poisons required incredible botanical knowledge. You had to identify the right plants, figure out which parts were toxic, determine proper preparation methods. Too weak and the poison doesn't work, too strong and it spoils the meat. And you had to pass this knowledge down accurately, because mistakes were fatal. This represents some of the most sophisticated pre-agricultural science humans ever developed. Detailed understanding of plant biochemistry, learned through centuries of observation, and doubtless many tragic errors. So why did all of this take so long? Why did 90,000 years pass between the emergence of modern humans and the development of agriculture and civilization? Because every successful survival strategy is inherently conservative. When something works, you don't mess with it. You teach it carefully to your children. You maintain the traditions that keep everyone alive. Innovation only happens when the old ways stop working, when climate changes or populations grow or resources decline, when the risk of trying something new becomes less than the risk of continuing as before. And here's the beautiful, frustrating truth about pre-agricultural human technology. It was perfectly adapted to its purpose. These weren't primitive people making do with inadequate tools. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherers with technologies optimized for their lifestyle. They could feed themselves with less work than early farmers. They had more leisure time, better nutrition in many cases, lower disease rates. The slow march of progress wasn't slow because humans were stupid. It was slow because for most of human history, there was no reason to hurry. Life was hard, but it was sustainable. Tools worked. Strategies succeeded. Generation followed generation in relative stability. Innovation happened at exactly the pace it needed to. No faster, no slower. Just enough to adapt when conditions changed. Just enough to survive. But that careful, conservative, successful way of life was about to encounter its greatest challenge. Because all these innovations, these slow accumulations of technology and knowledge, were creating something their inventors never intended. The preconditions for civilization. Here's something that's going to blow your mind. For 90,000 years before civilization, humans lived in groups of maybe 25 to 50 people. That was it. Your entire social world. Everyone you would ever meet, everyone you would ever love or hate or compete with, numbered less than the occupancy of a modern coffee shop. But here's the thing. They weren't isolated. These tiny bands of humans, scattered across continents, separated by hundreds or thousands of miles, were somehow connected. Trading goods they had never made, telling stories about places they'd never seen, speaking languages they'd never heard. They had created something that shouldn't have been possible given their technology. A network. A human network that spanned the entire inhabitable world. So how did they do it? How did people who might live their entire lives without meeting more than 100 individuals manage to maintain connections across distances that would take months to traverse? The answer lies in a set of social structures so ingenious, so perfectly adapted to their circumstances, that we're only now beginning to understand how sophisticated they really were. Let's start with the basic unit, the band. 25 to 50 people, usually related by blood or marriage. Parents, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. This was the core group that moved together, hunted together, raised children together, and crucially, survived together. Band societies operated on a scale that seems almost unimaginable to us today. Everyone knew everyone, not just their names, but their personalities, their strengths, their weaknesses, their quirks. You knew who was the best tracker, who could predict weather patterns by reading clouds, who could mediate disputes, who told the best stories around the fire. This intimacy created something modern society has largely lost: complete accountability. You couldn't be a free rider in a band of 30 people. You couldn't fake competence or hide laziness. If you didn't contribute, everyone knew. If you hoarded resources while others starved, everyone saw. If you caused problems, there was nowhere to hide. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite living in these tiny, intimate groups, our ancestors weren't provincial. They understood something fundamental about survival. Isolation equals extinction. Enter the gift exchange network. This was the circulatory system of pre-civilized humanity, the mechanism by which goods, genes, and ideas flowed between communities that might be separated by hundreds of miles. Here's how it worked. Your band makes camp near a river rich with fish. Another band, 2 weeks' travel away, controls a quarry with excellent stone for tool making. You need their stone. They need your fish. But there's no market, no currency, no merchants. So how do you trade? Through gifts. Elaborate, ritualized, carefully calibrated gifts that establish relationships, create obligations, and build trust across enormous distances. A hunting party from your band travels to the stone quarry bearing dried fish, carefully prepared, presented as a gift to the other band's leaders. No haggling, no negotiation, just a gift given freely. Sort of. Because several months later, when your band's toolmakers need new material, you send people back to that quarry. And the gift is reciprocated, not with fish, which would be insulting, too transactional, but with high-quality stone, carefully selected, presented with the same ritual formality. The gift acknowledges the relationship, maintains the connection, creates an obligation that might be fulfilled years later by people not yet born. These networks extended for thousands of miles. Archaeological evidence shows shells from coastal regions appearing in sites hundreds of miles inland. Obsidian from volcanic regions showing up in territories that had never seen a volcano. Ochre pigments travelling across entire continents. But the networks weren't just moving goods. They were moving information, stories about distant regions, warnings about dangerous territories, knowledge about new tool techniques, reports of animal migrations, climate patterns, water sources. Every interaction was an opportunity to update your mental map of the world beyond your immediate territory. Most importantly, the networks were moving genes. Because here's the brutal truth about bands of 25 to 50 people. If you only mate within your group for a few generations, you're doomed. Inbreeding depression sets in, birth defects increase, fertility declines, the band collapses. Our ancestors understood this, not intellectually perhaps, but practically. They developed exogamy systems, social rules that required or at least strongly encouraged mating outside your immediate group. This meant that periodically, usually at certain times of year when multiple bands gathered at shared resource sites, young people from different groups would pair off, form partnerships, and one of them would leave their birth band to join their partner's community. This was traumatic. Imagine leaving the only people you've ever known, travelling for weeks to join a group of strangers who might speak a different dialect, have different customs, different stories, different ways of doing everything, but it was necessary for the genetic health of both groups, for maintaining the networks that kept everyone connected, for ensuring that no band became too isolated, too inward-looking, too vulnerable. Now, you might be wondering, with no police, no courts, no formal legal system, how did these societies handle conflict? Because conflicts were inevitable. Personality clashes, romantic jealousies, disputes over food distribution, arguments about where to camp or when to move. In a modern society of strangers, we handle this through impersonal legal institutions. But in a band of 30 people, who all depend on each other for survival, they developed something more elegant: social pressure, mediation, and when necessary, ostracism. Most conflicts were resolved through mediation. Respected elders, usually people known for wisdom and fairness, would intervene in disputes, not as judges imposing sentences, but as facilitators helping the parties reach acceptable solutions. The goal wasn't punishment, it was restoration of harmony. Because a band that can't resolve conflicts peacefully is a band that's going to split apart or collapse. But what about serious violations? Murder, rape, theft that threatened group survival? For these, bands had ostracism. The most severe punishment imaginable in a world where your survival depended entirely on your group. Kick someone out of the band, and you're almost certainly sentencing them to death, either from starvation, predators, or hostile encounters with other groups. The mere threat of ostracism was usually enough to prevent serious violations, because everyone understood the stakes. Step too far out of line, and you're not going to prison. You're going to die alone in the wilderness. This system worked because of the scale. You can't have mediation-based conflict resolution in a society of millions. You can't use social pressure to modify behaviour when most people are strangers, but in a band of 30, people where everyone's survival depends on cooperation, it was remarkably effective. Leadership in these societies was similarly adapted to the intimate scale. There were no kings, no chiefs with inherited authority, no formal hierarchies, but there were definitely leaders. people whose opinions carried weight, whose decisions were followed, who could organize cooperative activities. But leadership was earned, not inherited. You became influential by demonstrating competence, by being a skilled hunter, an expert tracker, a wise counselor, a gifted storyteller, by sharing generously, mediating disputes fairly, making good decisions when the group faced challenges. Leadership was provisional, contextual, and constantly renegotiated. The best hunter might lead a hunting expedition, but when the band needed to decide where to relocate for the season, they might defer to the elder who had memorized decades of seasonal patterns. When social conflicts arose, a different individual known for diplomatic skills might take the lead. Authority shifted depending on the situation. This egalitarianism wasn't ideological, it was practical. In a group of 30 people where everyone knows everyone's capabilities, you can't maintain authority through force or inherited status. You maintain it through demonstrated competence and continued contribution. But there was one category of individuals whose status was unique: the elders, particularly the grandmothers. In most mammals, females die shortly after their reproductive years end. It's metabolically expensive to keep living once you can't reproduce. Evolution doesn't favour it. But human females regularly live decades past menopause. Why? The grandmother hypothesis suggests an answer. Post-reproductive females became knowledge repositories. They had survived multiple climate fluctuations, multiple seasonal cycles, multiple migrations. They remembered which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They knew how to predict weather, how to find water in drought years, how to process difficult foods that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Most importantly, grandmothers freed up younger women to have more children by helping with childcare. A woman with a living mother or mother-in-law could have children more frequently and raise them more successfully. The survival advantage was enormous, enough to offset the metabolic costs of extending female lifespan decades past reproductive capacity. This created a gerontocracy of sorts, not through formal authority, but through indispensability. When the band faced decisions about where to go, what to eat, how to respond to changing conditions, everyone listened to the grandmothers, because they had seen it all before. They were living libraries of survival knowledge accumulated over 70, 80 years of experience. Now, here's something that's going to seem contradictory. Despite all these networks, all this gift, exchange, all this inter-band mating, human groups were simultaneously becoming linguistically diverse. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that by 50,000 years ago, human populations across different regions were speaking mutually unintelligible languages. How is this possible? If groups were constantly interacting, why didn't they all speak the same language? Because linguistic drift happens fast, much faster than genetic drift. A group that separates from its parent population will develop a distinct dialect within a few generations. Within 1,000 years, their descendants might be speaking a completely different language. Multiply this across thousands of isolated bands scattered across 3 continents, and you get explosive linguistic diversification. But this diversity didn't prevent communication. The gift exchange networks, the seasonal gatherings, the exogamy systems, they all continued functioning. Because humans are really good at learning languages, especially when survival depends on it. Bilingualism, even multilingualism, was probably common. The person who joined your band from another community 200 miles away, they brought their language with them. Some of their words probably entered your band's vocabulary. Your children might grow up speaking elements of both languages. This created a linguistic landscape far more complex than anything we see today. Not a few dominant languages spoken by millions, but thousands of languages spoken by dozens or hundreds, each one carrying unique cultural knowledge, unique ways of categorizing the world, unique stories about human origins and destiny. The networks held it all together. The intimate bands were the foundation, the elders were the memory, the gift exchanges were the circulation, the exogamy rules were the genetic mixing. The earned leadership was the decision-making. The mediation systems were the immune response, dealing with conflicts before they could destroy group cohesion. For 90,000 years this system worked. It kept humans alive through ice ages and interglacial periods, through droughts and volcanic winters, through megafaunal extinctions and rising sea levels. It allowed populations to remain genetically healthy, despite being scattered across enormous distances. It enabled the accumulation and transmission of knowledge that would eventually transform into agriculture, cities, and civilizations. But it was fragile, built on trust, maintained by constant effort, vulnerable to any shock that disrupted the networks or destroyed the bands. When the climate began changing again, when resources became unpredictable, when populations grew large enough that strangers started encountering each other in territories no one controlled, the old systems began breaking down. What came next would change everything. But it was only possible because of the social scaffolding our ancestors had spent 90,000 years constructing, the networks that connected them, the languages that let them communicate, the kinship systems that kept them genetically healthy, the leadership structures that let them make collective decisions, the elder repositories of knowledge that let them survive disasters. We think of civilization as a sudden transformation, but really it was the culmination of nearly 100,000 years of social experimentation, of humans learning one generation at a time how to live together, work together, and survive together in a dangerous world. And then the ice came back. Picture this. You're living in a small band of maybe 30 people, somewhere in East Africa, 74,000 years ago. Your ancestors have been in this territory for thousands of years. You know every water source, every fruit tree, every place where game animals gather. Life isn't easy, but you've got it figured out. You've developed routines, strategies, knowledge passed down through generations. Then one morning you wake up to darkness. Not the darkness of night, but something else entirely. The sun should have risen hours ago, but the sky remains dim, filled with a strange red glow. Ash begins falling like snow, covering everything. Within days it's several inches deep, within weeks it's up to your knees. The temperature drops, plants start dying, animals disappear. What you don't know, what you can't possibly know, is that 5,000 miles away, in what will one day be called Indonesia, a mountain has exploded with the force of several million nuclear bombs. Mount Toba has erupted, and it's ejected so much material into the atmosphere that it's blocking out the sun across half the planet. The Toba supervolcano eruption was the most powerful volcanic event to occur during the entire existence of modern humans. We're talking about an explosion that ejected approximately 670 cubic miles of rock and ash into the stratosphere. To put that in perspective, when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it was considered catastrophic. Toba was 5,000 times larger. The immediate effects were devastating. Massive tsunami waves would have swept across coastlines. Ashfall blanketed everything within 2,000 miles under several feet of volcanic debris. But the real killer came next. All that ash in the atmosphere blocked sunlight for years, maybe decades. Global temperatures plummeted by 5 to 15 degrees Celsius. This wasn't just a cold snap. This was a volcanic winter that lasted for generations. Some scientists think this event nearly ended humanity. The genetic evidence is compelling. When you look at human DNA diversity, there's this strange pattern. We all show signs of having descended from an incredibly small population that existed right around the time of the Toba eruption. we're talking maybe 3,000 to 10,000 individuals total. That's it. For comparison, there are more endangered mountain gorillas alive today than there were humans on the entire planet after Toba. But here's the thing, we survived. Somehow, against odds that would make a statistician weep, our ancestors made it through. Not just barely, not just clinging to life by their fingernails, but survived in a way that let them eventually thrive and repopulate the planet. How? That's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night. Because the Toba eruption wasn't a one-time disaster. It was the trigger for a 1,000-year volcanic winter followed by centuries of climate instability. Your ancestors didn't just need to survive one crisis. They needed to survive generations of ongoing catastrophe, while maintaining enough genetic diversity to avoid inbreeding, enough cultural knowledge to keep technological innovations alive, and enough social cohesion to prevent groups from splintering into isolation. The answer lies in something remarkable about human adaptability. Your Toba surviving ancestors weren't passive victims of climate disaster. They were active problem solvers, constantly innovating, constantly adapting. The archaeological record from this period shows something unprecedented, a sudden acceleration in technological sophistication. Before Toba, human toolkits were relatively simple and changed slowly over millennia. After Toba, everything speeds up. You see rapid diversification of tool types, evidence of long-distance trade in high-quality stone, the first clear signs of symbolic behavior like personal ornaments. This wasn't random. This was necessity driving innovation at a pace evolution had never seen before. But Toba was just one crisis in a long series of climate catastrophes that shaped human evolution. For the entire time modern humans have existed, we've been living through what's called the Quaternary Ice Age. Now that name is a bit misleading because it makes it sound like one long frozen period. Actually, it's a cycle. A brutal, unpredictable cycle of glacial periods lasting tens of thousands of years, punctuated by brief, warm intervals called interglacials. During glacial maximums, ice sheets miles thick covered huge portions of Europe, Asia, and North America. Sea levels dropped by 400 feet, exposing vast coastal plains that are now underwater. The Sahara Desert expanded dramatically. Monsoon patterns shifted. Entire ecosystems collapsed and reformed in different configurations. Then, relatively quickly in geological terms, the climate would flip. Within a few thousand years, sometimes even faster, temperatures would spike upward. Ice sheets would melt, flooding coastlines and drowning entire landscapes. Deserts would bloom into grasslands, then forests. Animal populations would migrate hundreds of miles, following their preferred habitats as they shifted across continents. Your ancestors lived through dozens of these cycles. Imagine trying to maintain cultural continuity when the landscape itself keeps fundamentally changing. The coastal settlement your great-great-grandparents built, it's now 50 miles inland because sea levels rose. The river valley that sustained your people for generations, it's now a desert. The migration routes you followed for centuries tracking caribou herds. The caribou are gone, moved north to follow the retreating ice. This kind of environmental instability would destroy most species. Indeed, it did destroy most of the megafauna species that had dominated the planet. The giant sloths, the woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the massive short-faced bears. All gone, victims of climate change and increasingly, victims of human hunting. And here's where the story gets complicated. Because humans weren't just passive survivors of climate catastrophes. We became agents of extinction ourselves. As our hunting technologies improved and our population expanded, we started having a measurable impact on the megafauna populations that had survived the climate cycles for millions of years. The archaeological evidence is pretty damning. Wherever humans spread, large animals started disappearing shortly afterward. Not immediately, not all at once, but over a few thousand years, which is basically instantaneous in evolutionary terms. Australia lost its giant kangaroos, its massive wombats, its terrestrial crocodiles within about 20,000 years of human arrival. The Americas lost 80% of their large mammal species within 2,000 years of human colonization. Now, was this entirely our fault? Probably not. Climate change was happening simultaneously, making survival harder for these massive animals that needed huge amounts of food. But human hunting pushed populations already stressed by environmental change past the point of no return. We learned to hunt cooperatively, to drive animals into traps, to use fire to modify landscapes in ways that benefited us, but destroyed habitat for others. This raises an uncomfortable question. Were our ancestors ecological villains? Maybe, but they were also desperate survivors trying to feed their children in environments that were constantly trying to kill them. They developed survival strategies that worked precisely because they were effective at extracting resources from challenging environments. Those strategies are fascinating. Archaeological sites from Ice Age coastal regions show that humans became specialists at exploiting marine resources when terrestrial game became scarce. They learned to harvest shellfish, catch fish, hunt seals and sea lions. The coastal populations were living along shorelines that are now hundreds of feet underwater, their settlements lost beneath the waves when sea levels rose after the last glacial maximum. Some archaeologists think these underwater sites might preserve evidence of more advanced societies than we currently know about. Settlements that lasted for centuries in favourable coastal locations, developing more complex social structures and technologies than were possible for inland hunting groups constantly on the move. But if they existed, they're gone now, buried under 300 feet of water and thousands of years of sediment. Inland populations developed different strategies. They became experts at seasonal migration, following game animals along established routes that took advantage of different ecosystems at different times of year. They learned to read landscape features in ways that let them predict where water would be found during dry seasons, where animals would gather during migrations, where plant foods would ripen at specific times. This required something unprecedented in mammalian evolution, long-term planning based on abstract time concepts. Your ancestors had to remember that even though it's currently dry summer, if you travel to this specific valley and wait for the full moon after the leaves change colour, huge herds of animals would arrive. That's not instinct. That's sophisticated cognitive mapping of both space and time. The genetic evidence shows that populations went through multiple severe bottlenecks during this period. Not as dramatic as Toba, but significant enough that we can detect them in modern DNA. Each time the climate shifted dramatically, populations crashed, groups died out, territories were abandoned. But each time, survivors figured out new strategies, adapted to new conditions, and eventually repopulated the empty territories. Natural selection was working in real time, visible across just a few generations. When climate shifted toward cold, individuals with stockier builds, better cold tolerance, and enhanced ability to metabolize high-fat diets had survival advantages. Their descendants became the cold-adapted populations like Neanderthals in Europe. When climate favored hot, dry conditions, individuals with tall, slender builds and enhanced sweating capacity did better. Their descendants dominated tropical and subtropical regions. But the most important selection wasn't physical. It was cognitive and social. The individuals who survived climate catastrophes weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the smartest, the most cooperative, the most innovative. They were the ones who could look at a new environment and figure out how to exploit it, who could maintain social bonds across multiple groups, ensuring knowledge sharing and mutual support during crises, who could teach their children not just specific survival skills, but the meta skill of learning itself, how to observe, experiment, remember, and adapt. By the time the climate finally stabilized about 12,000 years ago, your ancestors had become something unique in the history of life on Earth. A species whose primary adaptation was the capacity to adapt, who could survive anywhere, exploit any resource, overcome any obstacle, not through specialized biological evolution, but through cultural innovation and social cooperation. They had survived volcanic winters, ice ages, droughts, floods, and the extinction of most of the megafauna they depended on. They had been reduced to tiny populations clinging to survival in isolated refuges, then exploded across the planet again when conditions improved. They had faced catastrophes that would have ended any other species, and they were just getting started. Because all those skills learned during climate catastrophes, all that capacity for innovation and adaptation, was about to be deployed in a completely new direction. One that would change the world forever. The age of merely surviving was ending. The age of civilization was about to begin. So here's the question that haunts every archaeologist, every historian, every person who's ever looked at the timeline of human history and wondered, why then? Why, after 90,000 years of doing basically the same thing, hunting, gathering, moving with the seasons, did humans suddenly decide to stay put, to plant seeds, to build permanent settlements, to create what we call civilization? The standard answer goes something like this. The Ice Age ended around 12,000 years ago. Climate got warmer, plants grew better, somebody figured out farming. Boom, civilization. But that answer is criminally incomplete. Because here's what it doesn't explain. Humans had survived dozens of climate shifts before. They'd seen warm periods, cold periods, transitions between the two. The Ice Age wasn't even the worst climate event they'd experienced. So why didn't civilization happen 50,000 years ago? Or 70,000 years ago? Or during any of the other warm periods that came and went across those vast millennia? The real answer is that it couldn't have happened earlier. Not because humans weren't smart enough. They were the same species, same brains, same potential. But because civilization required something more than intelligence. It required the right conditions, the right knowledge base, and critically, the right population density. All three of those things only came together around 12,000 years ago, and it took 90,000 years of preparation to get there. Let's start with the climate, because that's where the story begins. Around 11,700 years ago, the last ice age finally ended. Not gradually, but relatively quickly. Within a few centuries, global temperatures rose. Ice sheets that had covered a third of the Earth's surface began retreating. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet as all that frozen water melted. And something unprecedented happened. The climate stabilized. This is the part most people miss. It wasn't just that things got warmer, it's that they got predictable. For the previous 100,000 years, Earth's climate had been wildly unstable. Temperatures could swing dramatically within a single human lifetime. A valley that had been lush grassland could turn to desert in 20 years. Rivers that had flowed for generations could disappear in a decade. This kind of instability makes agriculture impossible. You can't commit to farming when the rains might fail completely next year. You can't store surplus grain for winter when you might have to abandon your settlement and migrate hundreds of miles to survive. You can't invest in permanent structures when disaster could strike at any moment. But after 11,700 years ago, something changed. The wild swings stopped. The climate entered what geologists call the Holocene, a period of unprecedented stability. Rainfall patterns became reliable. Seasons became predictable. Rivers flowed consistently from the same sources year after year. For the first time in human history, you could plant seeds in spring with reasonable confidence you'd still be there to harvest them in fall. You could build a house and expect to live in it for decades. You could accumulate possessions without worrying you'd have to abandon them during an emergency migration. This stability created a window of opportunity. But opportunity alone isn't enough. You need someone ready to take advantage of it. And here's where those 90,000 years of experience become crucial. By 12,000 years ago, human knowledge had reached a critical threshold. Think about everything they had learned during that vast stretch of time. Which plants were edible, which were poisonous, which had medicinal properties, which animals could be hunted safely, which were dangerous, which might be approachable. How to make fire in any conditions, how to create dozens of different tool types, how to preserve food, tan hides, treat injuries, how to navigate by stars, predict weather patterns, find water in seemingly barren landscapes, how to maintain social bonds across generations, resolve conflicts without violence, coordinate group activities involving dozens of people. This was the accumulated wisdom of thousands of generations. Knowledge that had been tested, refined, and passed down through an unbroken chain stretching back to those bottleneck survivors nearly 1,000,000 years earlier. And by 12,000 years ago, this knowledge base had reached the point where something new became possible: intentional manipulation of plant life cycles. The Natufians were among the first to figure it out. Living in the Levant, the region around modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, they occupied a sweet spot. Mediterranean climate, diverse plant species, abundant wild grains growing in dense stands. Around 12,500 years ago, Natufian communities began doing something revolutionary. They stopped moving. Not completely, not all at once, but they established base camps where they'd return year after year. Permanent structures started appearing. Stone foundations for round houses, storage pits lined with clay, grinding stones too heavy to carry easily. Why settle down before agriculture? Because the wild grain was so abundant it made sense to stay near the harvest areas. Natufians developed sickles, specialized tools for cutting grain stalks efficiently. They built granaries for storage. They even started managing the landscape, probably clearing competing vegetation to let their preferred grain species dominate. They weren't farmers yet. They were still harvesting wild plants, but they were manipulating their environment in ways that blurred the line between foraging and agriculture. And then somebody made the crucial observation. Maybe it was accidental at first, seeds spilling from storage containers sprouting near the settlement, or maybe it was intentional experimentation. Either way, someone noticed that seeds planted in good soil in the right season would grow into plants. That you didn't have to wait for wild stands to produce. You could make your own. This wasn't a sudden revelation. The transition from foraging to farming took thousands of years. Early cultivators still spent most of their time gathering wild foods. Agriculture was supplementary, insurance against bad hunting seasons. But gradually, over hundreds of generations, the balance shifted. Cultivated plants became the primary food source. Wild foraging became the backup. And here's where population density enters the picture. Because agriculture, even primitive agriculture, produces more calories per acre than foraging. Much more. A family that once needed 50 square miles to survive could now feed themselves from a few dozen acres. This meant population growth. Explosive, unprecedented population growth. Villages that had housed 50 people grew to 500, then 5,000. Children who would have died in foraging societies because mothers couldn't carry more than one infant during migrations now survived because families could stay in one place. Within a few thousand years, human population density in agricultural regions increased tenfold, maybe 100-fold, And this created something that had never existed before: critical mass for social complexity. When you've got 5,000 people living in close proximity, you can't organise them the way you organised a band of 30 foragers. The old social structures based on kinship and face-to-face relationships stop working. You need new systems, hierarchies, leaders who aren't just the oldest or strongest, but who have specific authority. Specialists, people who don't produce food but provide other services. Toolmakers, healers, religious leaders, eventually warriors and administrators. Laws, formal rules that everyone agrees to follow, enforced by someone with the authority to punish violators. You need, in other words, civilization. And it happened independently in at least 6 different places around the world, because everywhere humans encountered the right conditions, they followed similar paths. In the Fertile Crescent, they domesticated wheat, barley, pigs, and goats. In China, it was rice and millet and pigs again. In Mesoamerica, maize, beans, and squash. In the Andes, potatoes and llamas. In sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and yams. In New Guinea, taro and bananas. Different crops, different animals, but the same basic pattern. Climate stabilizes, population density increases, social complexity emerges, and civilization begins. This wasn't coincidence. It was the inevitable result of 90,000 years of accumulated knowledge meeting the right environmental conditions. Every one of those foraging societies had been carrying the seeds of civilization within them for millennia. The knowledge was there. The social structures existed in embryonic form. The cognitive capabilities had been in place for tens of thousands of years. All that was missing was the stable climate and population density that would let those seeds germinate. But civilization came with costs that we're still paying today. Hunter-gatherers had been relatively healthy, with diverse diets and regular physical activity. Early farmers ate monotonous diets based on 1 or 2 staple crops, leading to nutritional deficiencies. Foragers had been relatively egalitarian, with limited hierarchy and abundant personal freedom. Agricultural societies developed rigid class systems, with elites controlling resources and masses labouring in fields. Hunter-gatherers rarely experienced epidemic diseases because populations were too small and dispersed. But pack thousands of people together with their domesticated animals, and you create perfect conditions for pathogens: smallpox from cattle, influenza from pigs, plague from rodents attracted to grain stores. The archaeological record is brutally clear. Early farmers were shorter than foragers, had worse teeth, more skeletal damage from repetitive labour, and died younger. So why did they do it? Why did every human society that encountered agriculture eventually adopt it, despite the obvious costs? Because they didn't have a choice. Once some of your neighbours started farming, population density in their territories increased so dramatically that foragers couldn't compete. An agricultural settlement of 1,000 people could field more warriors than 10 foraging bands combined. They could claim and defend more territory. They could absorb losses in conflicts that would devastate smaller groups. It was an arms race with no exit. Adopt agriculture or be displaced by those who did. Within a few thousand years of the first farming villages, hunter-gatherers were being pushed into marginal lands, deserts, Arctic regions, dense forests, places where agriculture wasn't yet viable. Everywhere else, civilization spread like a wave across the landscape, transforming everything it touched. But here's what's remarkable. It worked. Despite the costs, despite the suffering of those early agricultural generations, civilization survived. It grew. It developed writing, metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, medicine, philosophy, art. It created everything we now consider human achievement, and it all started with those 90,000 years of preparation. with countless generations learning, adapting, accumulating knowledge, with populations surviving climate disasters that should have destroyed them, maintaining social networks across vast distances, passing down wisdom through oral traditions, with all those unnamed people who figured out which plants to eat, which animals to hunt, how to make fire, craft tools, raise children, resolve conflicts. Every one of them contributed something to the knowledge base that made civilization possible. They were building toward this moment without knowing it, creating the foundation for everything that would come after. And when the climate finally stabilized, when conditions became right, their descendants were ready to take the greatest gamble in human history, to stop wandering, to plant roots, literal and metaphorical, to build something permanent. It had taken 90,000 years to get there. But when the moment came, they didn't hesitate. So here we are. At the end of a journey that spanned 90,000 years. From those first anatomically modern humans living in small bands across Africa, through climate catastrophes that should have destroyed us, migrations across continents that seemed impossible, and the slow, patient development of everything that makes us human. Art, language, technology, culture, civilization itself. But here's the thing that should absolutely blow your mind. For 90,000 years, nothing seemed to happen. I mean, if you dropped into the year 80,000 BCE, and then visited again in 20,000 BCE, you wouldn't see much difference. Same basic tools, same small groups, same struggles for survival, no cities, no agriculture, no writing, just humans doing what humans had always done. Hunting, gathering, making art, raising children, telling stories around fires. To a modern person, this looks like failure, like stagnation. We're trained to think of progress as constant, exponential, always accelerating. If you're not growing, you're dying, right? But those 90,000 years weren't wasted time. They were the foundation. Every single thing we take for granted about being human, the ability to cooperate with strangers, to learn complex skills, to teach our children, to create meaning through symbols, to survive in radically different environments, all of that was being refined, generation by generation, across those millennia. Our ancestors weren't waiting for civilization to arrive. They were building the cognitive, social, and emotional capacities that would make civilization possible. They were becoming human in the fullest sense, and they were doing it without instruction manuals, without experts to consult, without any guarantee that their experiments would work. Just trial and error, repeated across thousands of generations, each one learning from the last, adding tiny improvements, passing knowledge forward. Think about what that required. Patience beyond anything we can imagine today. If you invented a better way to make a spear, you might see it spread across your region in your lifetime if you were lucky. Maybe. More likely, your grandchildren would see it adopted. Your descendants 10 generations later might witness it becoming the standard. No instant gratification, no viral spread, just the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge through human networks that took months to traverse, and resilience. God, the resilience. We talked about the genetic bottleneck, about populations reduced to 1,280 breeding individuals for 117,000 years. But even in better times, survival was never guaranteed. Every generation faced droughts, diseases, predators, accidents. Children died, adults died, entire groups were wiped out by disasters we can barely comprehend today. And yet they kept going. They kept having children, kept teaching them everything they knew, kept believing there would be a future worth surviving for. This tells us something profound about human nature. We're not built for easy living. We're built for perseverance, Our brains, the ones you're using right now to process these words, those brains were shaped by 90,000 years of survival under conditions that would break most modern people in days. We're the descendants of people who could walk 20 miles in a day and still have energy to dance, who could track animals for weeks through unfamiliar territory, who could maintain hope through years of famine. And here's where it gets weird for modern humans. Your brain is still fundamentally Paleolithic. You've got the same basic neural architecture as someone living in 30,000 BCE. Your fight or flight responses, your social instincts, your desire for belonging, your need for purpose and meaning, all of that was calibrated for small group survival in unpredictable environments, which explains a lot about why modern life feels so strange sometimes, why social media can feel simultaneously connecting and isolating, why we can have everything and still feel empty, why we crave experiences that have nothing to do with survival or reproduction. Our ancient brains are trying to navigate a world they weren't designed for, looking for belonging in groups of thousands instead of dozens, seeking meaning in careers instead of in daily survival, trying to feel significant in a world of 8 billion people instead of a few hundred. But it also means we carry capacities most of us never tap into, the ability to endure hardship that our ancestors took for granted, the capacity for patience that built technologies over centuries, the instinct for cooperation that kept human networks alive through the worst crises, the creativity that found solutions when the rules stopped working. These aren't lost, they're just dormant, waiting for circumstances that demand them. Maybe that's the real lesson from those 90,000 years. Progress isn't just about going forward, it's about knowing where you came from, understanding the long, patient journey that brought us to this moment, appreciating that every comfort you enjoy, every technology you use, every social institution that protects you, all of it rests on foundations laid by people who will never be remembered, never be celebrated, who lived and died in obscurity but kept the flame of human consciousness burning through the darkest times. If you've made it this far, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into the human story. And maybe, just maybe, take a moment to appreciate the long road that brought you here. Because you're not just a person living in the present, you're the culmination of 90,000 years of human persistence, the latest chapter in a story that's still being written, and that's pretty incredible when you think about it.